Hello and good afternoon, and thank you for joining our webinar today, Rethinking First and Last Mile Transit-Driven Complete Streets. And today we are going to be joined by Michael Baker International, the American Public Transit Association, and of course we are your hosts, Smart Growth America and the National Complete Streets Coalition. My name is Emiko Atherton, and I am the director of the National Complete Streets Coalition, which is a program of Smart Growth America, and we work to advance the Complete Streets movement across the United States through technical assistance, thought leadership, and advocacy. And I'm so excited to kick off our June webinar talking about really the importance of transit and complete streets. This year, for those of you, many of you who follow the coalition, you know that we're focusing in this webinar series and really all of our work on the implementation of completes and centering equity within everything we do. And I think transit really hits at the nut of this. Transit is incredibly important for many people in the United States. It connects us to jobs, schools, and other resources. It promotes exercise, walking to and from stations. It costs less per person per trip than driving and reduces greenhouse gas emissions. It really does provide the ability for many people who can't complete an entire trip through walking or biking or other means to become less dependent on the automobile. It also is the main line of transportation for many people. Compared to commuters, public transportation commuters in the Jacksonville area, and we will hear more about this today, are more than 3.6 times as likely to live in poverty and have a median income half as high. You can see this here on the breakout chart, and what's really interesting is, said another way, you know, most of us spend about 18% of our budgets on transportation. Low-income households spend up to 50% of their take-home income on transportation. That's often because they live in communities where they don't have good access to transit, to really access, you know, any type of opportunity, whether that's job opportunity, access to health care, to their faith-based institutions. And so they end up having to drive everywhere and spending half of their take-home spendings on transportation and not on other things like food, books for school, health care needs. And so we can see really the importance of why transit plays such an important role in equity. But I'm going to turn it over now to really the experts today, and I'm going to start with Rich Weaver. I'm so excited that this is actually the first time that we have Rich on a webinar. Rich is the Director of Planning, Policy, and Sustainability at the American Public Transportation Association, otherwise known as APTA, in Washington, D.C. But he's also the chair of the National Complete Streets Coalition, and really one of the leaders of the Complete Streets movement throughout the country. He has been around on the coalition since practically the beginning and is such an advocate for complete streets, but really continuing to push the conversation about why we need to include transit in all conversations about complete streets. In his day job, when we're not using him to advance the movement, he also serves as staff advisor to the APTA State Affairs Committee and the APTA Policy and Planning Committee. And its subcommittees, he oversees the work of APTA Sustainability Committee and APTA Mobility Management Committee. He's been with APTA for over 30 years. He also serves, I know, on the Revolution Steering Committee, and many of you who have met Rich before know that he is always out there at conferences and continuing to promote the importance of transit and complete streets. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rich.
Thank you, Emiko. That was a very kind of introduction. I really appreciate that. I'm going to give an overview of the agenda just real quickly. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Complete Streets for Better Transit and give some examples of what folks are doing in Reno, Austin, Texas, Washington, D.C., San Diego, and then close with resources. I'm going to give a very high level and of some of the benefits to transit and complete streets, and that's where I'm going to start. And so you probably all have seen this slide before, but this is what Complete Streets is about, making sure our transportation network works for all users every time there's a new project. And APTA, as Emiko has mentioned, is a very proud supporter of Complete Streets and the Coalition. And transit agencies believe access and connectivity are keys for linking land use and transit decisions, but more importantly, access and connectivity are linking people to places. And in most transit systems, the vast majority of riders access transit by walking or rolling, that would be in a wheelchair and or a bike, to stops or stations. And in fact, APTA's report, Who Rides Public Transit, mentions that 69% of riders access transit by walking. So enhancing the safety and attractiveness of the pedestrian environment, that would mean safe crossings, adequate sidewalks, an attractive streetscape will make streets safer and more welcoming to people using public transportation. Now, these projects also impact transit operations, for example, the stop locations, the travel times, the reliability. So transit agencies should be brought into the planning process early. Now, transit agencies can also partner and do partner with local governments to focus service improvements in conjunction with Complete Streets projects, and can also be a source of funding for bus stop improvements as part of an overall project. The complete trip from out the door to the rail station or bus stop, the ride along the corridor, and the final destinations are important elements of Complete Streets. So even before coming out the door, that trip app can be a really good component of making a complete trip and the Complete Streets and transit work together. Now, we all know that incomplete streets are not good for riders and not good for service. But with better connections to transit, the benefits can include some that was mentioned already: improved equity, increased access to jobs and affordable housing, makes better use of resources, limit growth in VMT, control rising costs of road construction and maintenance. And of course, one of the biggest benefits is safety is improved with reduced crash rates. With Complete Streets, there are abundant and safe crossings with good sidewalk, street connectivity. So safe and reliable service depends in large part on how the street right-of-way is designed and function. Another benefit, of course, is increased value of development. The importance of transit varies based on the nature of a development. However, proximity to high-quality transit service does increase the value of most development if transit is not just proximate but accessible. And Complete Streets are essential to paratransit customers who prefer to use fixed route instead of paratransit for most trips because of the ease of access, location to stops, vehicle and transit staff who are welcoming to individuals with mobility issues. Now I'm going to give an example of what happens when you bus stop lacks amenities. And this slide says it all. It has no crosswalk, no sidewalk, no protection from sun or rain, hazardous ditch, difficult location for a bus sign, and no room for amenities. And unfortunately, this is not unusual. This is maybe more typical than it should be in many of our streetscapes. Now, the Regional Transportation Commission in Reno, Nevada, that's the MPO and the transit operator, has put out a bus stop toolbox. And there are several factors that determine placement of a bus stops: the operations and maintenance factors, passenger preference, accessibility, property owners, ordinance and regulations, and of course, politics. And in this photo, you can see the type of infrastructure that agencies incorporate in their projects to make accessing transit easier. The RTC of Washoe County has implemented a regional Complete Streets initiative that helps guide their transit projects. Because of this policy, RTC has developed a bus stop toolbox that they have recommended to transit agencies. So we recommend working with your MPO to create complete street plan, a bike and pedestrian plan, an AD and Americans with Disabilities transition plan, and work with developers and work with all stakeholders. Now, Capital Metro is the transit agency in Austin, Texas, And they are partnering with the City of Austin to collect field data relating to the accessibility of pedestrian pathways in Austin. They use GIS software loaded on tablets to collect data on sidewalks, driveways, curb ramps, and crosswalks. And then pathways are graded using the following classifications. Compliant, dash functional. Pathways meet all the ADA requirements. Non-compliant and functional. Pathway has some minor issues but may not be accessible to all passengers. And there's the bad one, non-compliant, non-functional. Pathway has major issues and is not accessible. And based on the data collected, Capital Metro and the City of Austin will continue to partner to make repairs and improve accessibility. And in the future, Capital Metro plans to use crowdsourced reporting of accessibility issues through a trip app. Another example of transit, complete streets as the underlying component for linking to transit is the San Diego Association of Governments, which is a forum for regional decision-making comprised of 18 cities and county governments. They've developed a safe routes to transit, a term used to describe street and sidewalk improvements that make it safer and more comfortable for people to walk or bike to and from transit stops and stations, as well as home, work, and retail destinations. Safe routes to transit access improvements are designed to enhance access to transit but benefit everyone who walks or bikes in areas up to a mile away from transit stations. SANDAG developed a framework for understanding potential safe routes to transit needs, project types, and costs throughout the San Diego region. Now, safe routes to transit is required for every new transit project, so a good program to emulate. Then I want to talk about, real briefly, Washington, D.C. Washington Metro has the Metro Rail Station Area Investment Study has proposed bicycle and pedestrian projects in all station areas. And WMATA compiled an inventory of unmet bike and pedestrian access needs at all of its 91 metro stations. Then they score these projects using 12 measures, which include measures around safety, ridership, equity, path to service, and amongst other things. And based on the top scoring projects, they receive priority for funding and implementation. And what they do is really have found that the complete streets is the connective tissue that links transit and access and connectivity. I'm going to close on two other things that APTA's been doing. APTA has developed has an urban design working group that has developed a few recommended practices for transit agencies that touch on complete streets and transit agencies. One in particular is defining transit catchment area, which provides information for assuring quality access to transit. The diagram on the left illustrates the transit catchment area or potential transit riders within a given area around transit. Having good connections for both pedestrians and cyclists increases the transit catchment areas and potential ridership. Being successful at implementing complete streets around transit requires the effective partnerships of many stakeholders. The Transit Agency Partnerships to Improve Urban Design and Enhance Service Effectiveness document provides valuable recommended practices for successful partnerships. And finally, I'm going to close on one of the products that's really been popular. APTA has a recommended practice on design of on-street station stops and access from surrounding areas. Transit agencies use this document to look at existing or new on-street stops and to provide input to local jurisdictions and developers to invest in pedestrian improvements. Local jurisdictions and the general public use this document to facilitate discussions about planning, design, and investment decisions made by public agencies and elected officials. Developers, planners, and architects also use this document in making design decisions regarding the interface of private development and the public realm where transit is present or planned. Now, this was just the tip of the iceberg for while transit involved with complete streets. We haven't even done a deeper dive into transit and along the corridor with BRT corridors and bikes. And I just see a whole lot of other webinars coming out with transit and complete streets in this series. So I just wanted to end there. And, well, I think we'll hold questions till later. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Emiko.
Thanks so much. That was excellent, Rich. And I love having you set the foundation for why this is so important. I was just in San Diego earlier this week, and for those of you that don't know, San Diego is actually one of the more dangerous places to walk in the state of California. And I was on a site visit where we looked at many communities where people are transit dependent, and yet it's very difficult for people to safely access transit. And when we were there, we actually saw a crash between a car and a pedestrian, someone trying to access a transit stop. So I think this work is so important. I do want to say that if you have questions, we'll be getting to all of those at the end. You should have a box in your lower left-hand corner called Q&A. Go ahead and type your questions in there, and then we'll get to each one of those after Fred's presentation. So I'm really excited next to introduce Fred Jones, who's currently a Senior Project Manager with Michael Baker International. I actually met Fred sometime last year in Florida as I was doing work with the Florida Department of Transportation, and Fred is based out of Jacksonville and really a strong advocate within the state, but also in the country for complete streets. He has over 15 years of public and private sector experience for a variety of community planning and mobility projects. His expertise is really around multimodal transportation planning, corridor studies, traffic impact analysis, public engagement, regulatory issues, mixed-use development, and, of course, complete streets. His training in anthropology really led his career in planning to believe urban planning is anthropology. Right now, or most recently, I should say, and actually when I met Fred, he served as the Senior Transportation Planner with the Jacksonville Transit Authority, otherwise known as JTA, and in this role, he oversaw JTA's Complete Streets program, which seeks to increase the first and last mile accessibility and safety of JTA's newly designed transit system. He's also a certified planner with a master's in urban and regional planning from Florida State University and currently chairman of the City of Jacksonville's Downtown Development Review Board, and was just elected to the City Council of Neptune Beach, Florida. So he's serving really in two different roles, as an elected and as a planner. So with that, I'll turn it over to Fred.
Thank you so much, Emiko, for this opportunity to share this story of Jacksonville. And I guess if there was ever a reason that equity would be one of the big prevailing themes of Complete Streets, the JTA and the Jacksonville case study really exemplifies that. This effort started about, and before I go into it, I'm going to talk a little bit about the agenda. But again, what I want to do here is talk a little bit about the overview of Jacksonville for those that haven't been here, and a little bit about JTA, the catalyst for why we felt the Transit-Driven Complete Streets program was important, a little bit about the process, some of the concepts, and just some of the next steps and the lessons learned and some takeaways that folks that are participating in the webinar will be able to take back to their own communities, hopefully. But again, I think a lot of this was driven, I didn't even really think much about Complete Streets. When I was at JTA, we were going through a system redesign, and it was only then when it became apparent that we had to think differently about our infrastructure to enhance access to the system. A little bit about Jacksonville, for those that haven't been here. Northeast Florida, we're a city of about 850,000. The metro area is about 1.5. Currently the 12th most populous city in the nation. And interesting, it's the second most popular for relocation. So it's a very popular city in the Sun Belt for relocation. As you may or may not know, it's currently the largest city in land area in the United States at 840 square miles because it's a consolidated government. But as you can imagine, if you divide that population over that square mile, that sort of gives you a perspective of the challenges that we would have with operating a fixed route bus system in the city. Next, a little bit about JTA. It was initially, ironically, founded as an expressway authority in 1955, so its initial task was to actually build roads. We had toll facilities here, and they didn't really get into the transit business until the early 1970s, when a lot of the private bus operators were fledgling, and so JTA took that over. So It's one of the few agencies in the country that actually has a true multimodal focus, where not only are we doing operations, but we're also building, designing roads, fixed route. JTA just launched a BRT system. There's paratransit. There's actually a monorail system in downtown, which is a really exciting project as they try to envision the future for that. There's a stadium shuttle. So just overall, there's about 220 vehicles in the system and around 13 million trips a year. Again, getting back to that story about how complete streets became really an elevated topic as I was at JTA, part of it was driven by JTA's system redesign. And there's a lot of systems in the country that are going through this process now of saying, it's not very efficient anymore. Rather than making iterative changes to our network to adjust this route or that route, it looks like the best approach is probably just to throw the baby out with the bathwater and start fresh and design your network appropriately to meet the needs of commuters and their origins and destinations in the 21st century. And so with that, when the new director, Nat Ford, took over, I think within a few weeks of riding the bus, he realized this is just unacceptable. So launched a program called the Route Optimization Initiative, and it was really the most transformative project in JTA's 30-year history. I often liken the system before the route optimization as a county-wide paratransit operation. We had no 15-minute service. There were a handful of routes that had 30-minute service, limited hours of duration. So, you probably understand that. And it just was very inefficient in terms, particularly with a workforce that needed to work later, needed to be on weekends, needed to have more frequent and reliable service, and to be able to grow the transit ridership. Well, fast forward, we do the ROI at the end of, launched in December 2014. 6 months later, we're seeing 6% increase in ridership. Oh, by the way, JTA also launches into a bus rapid transit era, which will eventually be the largest network in the Southeast at 57 miles. So we have this, this high-frequency network that's building with 10-minute peak service, really trying to transform the agency. But one of the big things that you recognize is that once you do this, it means you have to get rid of some of the circuitous routes. Not everybody can have that bus stop in front of their house. And so it means that people have to walk a little bit further. So Mrs. Johnson that's trying to get on the bus to maybe accustomed to having the route come out in front of her street, and they have to walk a little bit further. And that's so when it really became apparent about the shortcomings of the infrastructure and the lack of walkable infrastructure, just basic needs for people that are really trying to use transit in Northeast Florida. The other big catalyst here, and you may have seen this map. I love this map that Smart Growth America puts out. It was obviously, I know they've updated the information, but when you see this, I would often begin these presentations about complete streets just showing that and saying, what is that? And people would say, is that population density? Is that cell phone coverage? I mean, we got a lot of responses, but it's just a very powerful image to say, okay, what is this really? This is pedestrian deaths. And in Florida, it is beyond just, an unfortunate story. It's really a public health crisis. If there was ever a reason to advance complete streets, particularly in the state of Florida, it's really to get people off of this dangerous by design list, because Florida, as you know, when you look at the data, they changed the calculation a little bit. In 2014, we were third, so we moved to fourth. But really, the point is 9 of the top 11 metro areas are in the state of Florida. We're doing a really bad job. And this is just when you start talking about people that have to use transit and have to walk. I mean, you take it for granted. But here in the last 3 days, I was in Palm Beach County riding their system, and it was just amazing how unsafe I felt just trying to get to a stop. Basic things. Other big issues. So when you combine for cyclists, Jacksonville is actually the worst. So it's truly a public health crisis. And if this isn't reason enough to work to invest in this type of infrastructure, I don't know what it is. Again, you're constantly, there's not a day you can't see in the news where there was somebody that was killed walking or cycling in the state. I'll go through these next bits of slides here to just show you a little bit about what you experience. And these aren't anomalies. This is an everyday scenario. You have, obviously, a Sunbelt city, really started to develop after the automobile. So we have these wide, high-speed arterials. The pedestrian is given a lot of afterthought. And it's, this is a person trying to rush to get to the stop. And as you know, human behavior, people aren't going to necessarily walk that extra 500 yards down to the signalized intersection. They're going to mind the gap and try to cross there. So there's a lot of basic things like we need mid-block crossings. We need bicycle infrastructure because there's a lot of people, because they're having to walk a little bit further to those stops, they have to ride their bike. And, basic infrastructure for them is lacking. This picture here, when we're out doing some field work, there's a little boy, if you can kind of see right in the center, he is crossing. This is a service road in front of that vehicle. And it's just, this is the kind of scenario that you see all the time. His parents are kind of in front of the vehicle, in front of him. So it's bad. We have this scenario where if you're disabled, this is the conditions that you face in a lot of areas. And a lot of these areas are, as ERP pointed out, they're economically distressed areas, concentration of minorities, and I think in many respects the infrastructure has been left behind. And as we get later into the presentation, I'll show you a little bit about some of the data that suggests that we really have to look at these things a little bit differently. Again, good luck if you're trying to get your wheelchair through that scenario. But this is, really the experience every day for a lot of people that are having to access the bus system. This is a little bit about what that first mile, last mile experience is for people. We followed an apartment complex here to a stop just to the north of there. So that's kind of the destination. We followed this lady and her child in the stroller. As you can see, that's kind of the quality of the walk experience, even though there is bits of sidewalk. How really comfortable is that? This is kind of the conditions you face as you're trying to cross the intersection. As you can see in this straight ahead, there's a lady there. She's got her stroller. This is a high volume service road, and she's just trying to get to the stop that is sort of right in this space here. So this is kind of the conditions. So you feel like, okay, is this a safe place? Do I want to even be walking here? But this is kind of where the stop is at, and that's her final destination as she's waiting for the bus to come pick her up. So a real challenge. So that just gives you a little bit of a backdrop. And so with that, once JTA, redid the network, the system redesigned, it became apparent that the infrastructure had to be improved. And so part of this, a couple years ago, they were able to extend their local option gas tax. And I mentioned that JTA has this road building component. Within this, they developed a program called Mobility Corridors. And so this really, in effect, these blue lines are kind of, think about that as your sandbox. That's our high-frequency, newly designed high-frequency transit network. And this is the places that we really need to focus in on those countermeasures and those interventions about how to really improve the conditions for folks here. This was a $15 million program, so really it was a seed. Obviously, this is probably 70 miles of network. So we recognize that we have to really, get some baby steps, get some demonstration projects underway to be able to build this program. We know Florida, nationwide in the state, there's been this huge, tremendous movement on complete streets, not only from the coalition advocating it, you have NACTO, you have movements towards Vision Zero, so there's all of the headwinds are pointing like we have to think differently, number one. So there's a lot of resources that are available that we're building, and the State Department of Transportation is currently in its implementation plan and rolling out new standards, which will be very important, so that you really have a clear line of communication between, okay, when we want to do something that's on a state road, whether it be a lane elimination project or whatever, DOT, the local jurisdictions, they're speaking the same language. As I mentioned, DOT's Complete Street Implementation Plan. I would encourage folks to go to their website and kind of look at what they're doing. It's really an important part of this process because a lot of the roadways, as I showed you in the previous slide there, are state roads, and we have to work with the state to be able to do those improvements. So we have this Mobility Corridors program. I mentioned this idea you have limited funds. You certainly don't want to swallow the elephant, and that'll be one of the big takeaways as I leave you this presentation. But we began the process with just some pre-screening, and really this is just a simple analytical exercise. You may have heard of the term the 5 Ds, but to go in here, do a GIS analysis that showed where are the places that people would walk, where are we seeing the high concentrations of transit ridership, where is the design that would at least support some modicum of walkability, and so we transformed that into this. And so what this did was essentially give us some hot spots, and we would go out and follow it up with some walk audits to say, yeah, this is a place where we really should focus, because again, you've got a lot of distances of corridors here, and you're not going to be able to do everything. So you have to really start somewhere, and let's focus in each corridor some spot and really develop a set of keystone projects that we can advance. I think that's a good lesson for any community that's undertaking this Complete Streets initiative, to start small, get the wins, get the champions behind you, and then that way you'll feel better moving forward and you'll just have greater buy-in. When we started the process, this was August of 2015, we begin the mobility corridor, we go out into the community in each of these corridors, and this was spent, riding the bus, talking to folks, walking, engaging, really trying to tell the story about what's going on here. And when you take the bus, and I'm sure this is similar in a lot of in the Sun Belt, it's just a different experience for people that really, if you're in a position where you have to take transit, a lot of people have to get up an hour earlier and walk a long distance to get to the stop, and then they have to deal with the numerous stops, and sometimes it's not, out of the ordinary for a trip that by car might take 15, 20 minutes, may take an hour and a half, 2 hours by bus. And so it's very important to recognize that Complete Streets, to me, it's a customer service experience. It doesn't just begin when you get on the bus. It begins when you leave, you put your foot out on the sidewalk, if there is one, and you're going to the stop. And I think that's why this is so important. So we engaged with folks. We said, what's the story of the community? And as I mentioned, there's just so many things you could do, but what we said, we have to be able to, avoid swallowing the elephant and have some meaningful projects that you can move forward. And so we categorized everything into this sort of set of projects, and we call these the Keystone. Those are the things that you want to do, the big project at the intersection that you want to do tomorrow. There's a set of operational and safety that's kind of like, hey, by the way, we just need to strike that crosswalk. We just need to make sure the pedestrian actuated signal works. And that's just so important. And so you could go out there and do that tomorrow. And then we also grouped it into a set of long-term visions, because we know there's things that you might want to do, but funding is limited. We want to keep that in the story, but maybe it takes 5 or 10 years to get that done. Again, when you're going, particularly when you're dealing with elected officials, limited funds, you have a lot of projects, it's important to have a strategy for prioritization, and it's important to really be able to have a defensible set of criteria that says, look, this is where we want to start and why we're going to start here. And so we built the sort of a matrix for each of these corridors to say, okay, what are the places you should start? And so we built everything around a set of criteria, mobility and safety being one, planning and funding leverageability. Oh, by the way, we all know when there's a resurfacing project, that's one of the best opportunities to do these projects. Oh, we looked at public health and livability, economic development, and competitiveness. The next slide sort of shows you a little bit more in detail what those elements were. I think one of the interesting elements, that we looked at was also getting back to where I showed how people are having to walk on those high-speed, wide arterials. We looked at vehicle capacity ratios, and one of the things that we recognize is that many of these facilities are overbuilt. So you have a scenario where, 4-lane undivided arterial roadway with 8,000 trips a day on it. And, oh, by the way, we're seeing the highest incidences of pedestrian accidents and fatalities along these roads. So we sort of looked at the ADTs, comparing that to what the typical capacity of perhaps a 2-lane roadway is, and then overlaid that with the crash data, and we realized we have overbuilt facilities. So we looked at things like that. We looked at, are you in a food desert? By the way, you live in a neighborhood, you have to, while you're lacking the infrastructure there, and there is no place to get healthy, fresh produce. That's a big part of this. So you start weaving this story together, and it's more than just a sidewalk. It's about somebody's quality of life. It's livability. As I mentioned, the census, the overbuilt quarters, we did some analysis and I think this is a good analysis that anybody can do as well. Don't just look at the last 10 years, or look at the story of traffic for the last 30, 40 years if possible. And sometimes you'll see where when we overbuilt, we thought the traffic was going to be high, but in a lot of these places, you're seeing the volumes be stable or declining, yet the road still is 4 or 6 lanes. So this was kind of this is one of the key corridors coming out of North Jacksonville, and this is called Main Street. This red line shows kind of the existing capacity of what we would assume it would be doable at a 2-lane, and you're seeing stuff come well below that in the last 6-7 years. So that at least gives you some ballpark estimate. Hey, we think we can do something to reallocate the space here. Can we repurpose one of those lanes? And again, this is about safety. And we can say that it's pretty safe to assume that volume is going to continue. And can we do something different? And so, it's just a really good indicator of when you have to go to DOT, you have your data in your pocket, and you suggest that, hey, I think we can do something a little bit different here. Some of the concepts I'm going to talk about next, not only were we just looking at the granular scale of somebody trying to get to the stop and what they need, but also just about placemaking and livability and economic development and how we can do redevelopment through these projects. So everything that we looked at in some of these corridors, this was a BRT corridor for the First Coast Flyer that I showed earlier. If we were to repurpose some of these blocks and make them a little bit walkable, this is kind of what you can get ultimately. Over time, it may take 20, 30, 40 years, but having this as your framework moving in was very important, and this helps the community really get behind you. As I mentioned, this is an existing condition shown. This is a 4-lane undivided facility for that BRT corridor. What if we did something like that? This is one of our Keystone projects. In this case, perhaps a shared bike bus lane. We have 40 feet of right-of-way, so it's a little bit tight in there. But again, we want to preserve the functionality of the service, but we want to create a little bit of sense of place here. Main Street, which I was showing you those traffic volumes, this is a snapshot of this. This is immediately north of the center of downtown Jacksonville, 4-lane roadway with a center median that was put in about 15 years ago. Some of the stuff we heard from the people is, obviously the bus stops need to be improved. They're not very functional. A lot of the businesses along the corridor, they want the ability to make left turns. So there was a discussion about reestablishing the grid and making it a little bit more walkable. So these conversations all end up indirectly supporting access to the transit system when you can get the walkability equation right. And ironically, sometimes you do these medians, and they're beautiful, but they're beautiful for the vehicles that are driving fast, pass through your neighborhood. So again, it's that whole discussion of, do you want people to come to this district too, or do you want them to go through it? And people really recognize that, we want people to go here slowly. We want to make a nice multimodal corridor and support the businesses in this area as well. So that's one of the concepts that we have. One of the things that we're looking at now is converting this to maybe actually a protected cycle track. And also, as I mentioned earlier, JTA has a monorail system. There's a discussion of maybe having an autonomous vehicle run down there. So that's one of the other suggestions. One of these earlier photos, as I mentioned, showed you earlier, this is an overpass. People do ride their bike here. This is kind of a condition. What if we did this to sort of repurpose the space? And the good thing is that the traffic volume suggests that you can do this. It's just, again, building the will. This is one of our last Keystone projects. This is at the corner of University Boulevard and Merrill, which is east of downtown across the St. Johns River. What if we did this? This kind of thing. So really, when you have the placemaking story combined with the access to transit, you really start to build the champions, and that's what's really important. I want to wrap up here, obviously leave some time for some questions or any insight to just some takeaways. When we started out this, it was very interesting as kind of defining the program. Initially, I think it was sort of the sense of we just need to redo the shelters. Maybe we can put a sidewalk connection to it, maybe a bike lane, kind of small. Really wasn't even using the term complete streets. It was just, we're going to redo the network and we have to have our shelters and stops upgraded. But once we step back and you really start to see the experience of people as they try to access the system, it really becomes, we should have a complete street program. So defining that was a little bit early on, really being strategic, beginning with the end in mind. Ultimately, what is it that you want to have happen in 5 years after this project? And that became, really the calling card. And going to people and telling them about how do we get ourselves off of this list, those messages, simple messages to elected officials. We're the third or fourth worst metropolitan area for pedestrian deaths. Is that reason enough? These kind of things, and why we should think a little bit differently. Other big thing, we had, just some coordination, DOT, the city of Jacksonville. You have some cases where it's a state facility, but really it's a community city project, but then JTA actually is the transit agency building it or providing funds for the construction, just coordinating all that. We also had some resistance because I mentioned you want to do something meaningful at the outset that people can get their hands around, a demonstration project. We had a little bit of some resistance to that, but I think this Keystone effort is really helping to facilitate that discussion. Some of the big lessons learned, I can't emphasize enough, sticking to the message. Be mission, really about the mission, getting people access to the transit system and building a network of complete streets that support multimodal travel and are equitable. For people, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Sometimes it's just people want to be able to safely get to the stop with a sidewalk at 4 o'clock in the morning when it's dark out. And then other places, maybe there's an opportunity to do things like cycle tracks. But I think the equity piece of this was very important. And really, what do we want at the end? And the process will take care of itself. Don't get hung up in the weeds of whether it should be a 10.5 or 11-foot travel lane. We just have to get something done here. The transit-driven approach, I think that was the real key, too, for JTA's success in selling this program, is that it's about access to the transit system. It's not just about, we want to put some beautiful landscaping or provide, a nice shared space next to some high-rise condos where people can walk. That's very important, but in this case, it really is getting people to that system. The other big bit is the attractive collateral. I can't emphasize enough, not the 300-page planning study, but an executive summary that you can give to the elected officials that says, hey, this is important. Here's a project in my corridor. I want to get this done. So we actually produced sort of a coffee table-like book so that the message would continue to move forward. I mentioned this probably 3 times. Don't swallow the elephant. Really try to get something done small that you can build champions around. And really, and I think this is the last bit, is to kind of rethink this first and last mile experience. We use that term so interchange, all the time, really loosely. It's just the first mile, last mile, but what does that really mean at a granular scale? And we're continuing to sort of investigate that. We're working with APTA and TRB to have this be really something as a theoretical approach about who is responsible for that. How do you break that down? And because you get beyond the half mile, what is truly walkable? One that's comfortably walkable, and really, what are those issues? Because between the first 50 and 100 feet, you have a set of issues. Beyond 500 feet, it changes a little bit. You get beyond, and so it's really important, I think, to really look at that a little bit more in detail, delve into the issues, look at the infrastructure needs, and quite frankly, who's responsible as well. I think many a times, unfortunately, the transit agency is just the operator, and they're jockeying for position to get some facilities in there or some infrastructure in place, but the city or the DOT is the one responsible for designing and putting that into play. And sometimes there's just a huge disconnect. And I really believe that transit agencies, it would be wonderful if they had a pot of money that they could really be responsible and have a say in how this thing is designed, and could actually construct it and maintain it over time, because I really believe that this is a customer service experience for people that are actually walking from their origin to the stop. It doesn't begin when you get on the bus. And I think that's part of the whole experience of riding transit. So really right now, as we move towards the next steps, those Keystone Projects, as I mentioned, we have 4 of them. There were 14 corridors, but we identified 4 key projects with the limited funds to be able to advance, and right now we're working through the preliminary engineering design, looking to leverage some additional funding. And the most important thing, which was really good about this message, is that when it got in front of the JTA board, they thought it was just so important that they feel that this should be an ongoing program, not just a one-time deal, but they actually own some surplus property, but to explore using the real estate assets that they own, whether the sale of surplus properties or lease of properties around their stations, to actually fund this infrastructure, this Complete Streets program moving forward, because obviously you have a host of projects and that you could spend the next 10 years working on. And that's, I think that's really important. Again, just leave everybody, I love this quote, but it really does come down to walkability and safe and equitable access for people. We often take it for granted when we get in our cars and go places, but I just spent the last 3 days in Palm Beach County riding the bus, and it really was eye-opening, and it really, for a lot of people, it's just, I need that sidewalk, I need to feel safe, I need lighting to get me to the stop, not asking for anything else, and it's a real big issue, and hope we can continue to try to make a difference. And with that, I can turn it back over to you, Emiko.
Thank you so much for that, both of you, Rich and Fred. That was fabulous. And we have so many questions. I actually have a lot of questions. But thank you for really setting that foundation on why transit is such an important part, really, of the transportation system, but how it integrates with Complete Streets. Just a reminder, we have about 10 minutes for questions. If you do have questions, please put them in the lower left-hand box, and we will try to get to as many as possible. I will say, both Fred and Rich, we have so many questions. I know we're not going to get to all of them today. We always do send a follow-up recap blog post where we have a link to the presentation. So this was recorded, and you'll be able to see it again. We also, I know that our presenters, Fred and Rich, have agreed to answer some questions that we don't get to within the blog recap. So don't fret if you don't get to your questions answered. I think we have about 20 so far. And I know I have a few of my own. So with that, I'll turn it over to questions. I think my first question would be really to either one of you, and I saw this question come up as well, is, once you make these improvements and once you really start to move forward in integrating Complete Streets and access to transit into this, both in the examples you talked about, Rich, but maybe let's start with you, Fred, is, did you see an increase you mentioned you saw an increase in ridership, and did you see an increase in people biking and walking to transit, or was that measured? And if that was measured, did you look at the who of that? Were you measuring people's age, their race, their gender? So really, did you do performance measures around this initiative? Is the nexus of the question.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the next step. I think initially getting this out, we're looking really just at the increase in ridership, and there's some effort going on now to look at that a little bit more in detail to see who, in fact, what was the characteristics of those riders. Were they more choice riders, people that weren't ever taking the bus before, that felt like the system now, it's more frequent and reliable. I can now maybe give up my, car trip so often. So that's part of the ongoing initiative. The big thing was that we just saw an increase in ridership, but it's pretty obvious. I mean, when you go to the place, you look at, for example, in Jacksonville, the northwest part of the city has the highest concentration of transit-dependent folks, and you go out there and you have to really get it for them, because again, you have to start with where you see the vast majority of the riders and make sure we're serving them well. And through this process, I think that's what we want to do. Let's get some basic infrastructure in place, bike lanes, some sidewalks, and then just kind of build from there. It's a big undertaking, but this, I think, really elevates the importance of the whole program and moving forward. And I think those will be things that you'll want to look at probably like 5 years from now. What difference did we make as we get it? Right now we're in this preliminary engineering and design phase for these projects, and get them done. Look at some of the small short-term solutions that we've done, and see what improvements we're making, because it's just so apparent. I mean, every day you see in the paper somebody dies getting hit, and it's just like, oh, and that is just, we got to fix that. And if it means, whether it's a sidewalk or just a simple mid-block crossing somewhere, let's get that in and see if we can make a dent in it. And so that's kind of my answer. I don't know if that helps much, but that's where we're at.
That's great. No, that does. And that kind of leads me to my next question, or a question from the Q&A boxes. We definitely, I think, all three of us, and probably most of you who are joining us on this webinar, recognize this is something we need to be doing, whether we're measuring it or not. People are dying every day. As Fred mentioned, our Dangerous by Design report, but between the decade of 2005 and 2014, 46,149 people were struck and killed while walking on America's streets. That doesn't include the number of people injured or the number of people biking, and we need to do more. And one question, and Rich, you might know the answer to this, is how can state DOTs who really administer many of the transit funding programs encourage or provide technical assistance for this type of planning, like what happened at JTA, to ensure that there's more, that we are funding more projects with these great benefits? So how can a state DOT help other transit agencies move this forward? Because unfortunately, while Florida is one of the most dangerous places to walk, it's certainly not alone in the country.
Oh, Amico, that's a good question. I may not have the right answer, but I do think many states who have a statewide complete streets policy are just laying the groundwork for helping get out more technical assistance to jurisdictions and transit agency and city partnerships to help them really give them the technical assistance to monitor and measure how they can improve. Funding programs are so competitive, and so funding always is one of those key items that really everyone say, how can I do this? I mean, our friends up in Anchorage, Alaska, who are really looking at this in a way you wouldn't think, because they're dealing with so many other different conditions, where it's snow and cold, and yet they really want to keep that complete streets funding as a source of funding. I think we just need to work with our state public transit associations, who can be a great advocate for working with the state DOTs to say, hey, this funding will help you. Many of them in the state who manage the state programs under the state DOT deal with the 5310 program, which goes above and beyond ADA services. And the 5310 program is a federally funded program filtered through the state DOTs, and they're eligible for many things, but one of them is building safe and accessible pathways to transit. So we may want to look at that 5310 program and be a more advocate for using that resource, but you got to work through your state DOT as a partner in that. So maybe there's other mechanisms down the road. I just want to go back to something you mentioned on the last question about ridership, and I really think Washington D.C. has been really doing a really good job of scoring projects using performance measures, which include safety, ridership, equity, paths to service. And we may want to we're working with WMATA, Office of Planning, just to see how they are using that to help fund those projects to receive priority funding in that case. And when there's broken pathways or broken access, they're finding that ridership does decline. Once they fix that access, it's not as the bird flies. It's getting how you get around corners and little nooks and crannies and cross streets in the middle of cross streets. that they find that that access, and it's safe cross streets. It's in the middle of intersections. It's not just the intersection itself, but they're putting lighting and markings to help make it safe. I think this is something we're really going to keep a close eye on and see how that would. Ridership is such an important characteristic for transit agencies. They're all looking at the decline in ridership right now, to be perfectly frank, and we want to find out maybe this access and that connectivity will increase ridership, and it sounds like it was doing a good job in Jacksonville. It could be in other areas, so that's an important function.
Thanks so much, Rich. The next question I have, and really this is directed at you, Fred, is, we at the Coalition, and you and I have talked a lot about equity, and this came up, again, so much in your presentation, and you showed, really some of the most dangerous places to walk in the United States, or some of the most I'd say like they suffer from, under infrastructure, they're overbuilt. And how did you schedule and structure your community workshops and Rich to really encourage diverse and equitable community presentation? How did you get the input of the community as you were doing the planning process?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we went out directly to the folks because, obviously you can only get so many folks by simply advertising and say, come to our meetings. But we went to the neighborhood associations, we went to the community housing development agencies, the nonprofits, and sat down initially, began doing some interviews, engaged with said, who are the people, even sometimes going to the local churches, and we would schedule time. We'd say, okay, we're going to be here, between Monday and Wednesday from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. or whatever it may be, and we just said, hey, can you get me 30 people to come here? And that was it. I think sometimes you just have to go to them and make them aware, because a lot of folks didn't, when we kickstarted the project off, they were a little concerned. I think they didn't recognize JTA as building complete street. It's typically, is this a meeting about a bus service change? And so we had to educate some folks that no, we're really interested in transforming the infrastructure that gets you to the bus. And so once we educated folks, met with them, but it takes grassroots, going to the agencies and meeting with them and bringing people out, and they would bring folks, to ensure that we got participation. And so it's not so much particularly with distressed communities, they often have a distrust. They've been left behind, and that's a big thing. Getting them there, you say you're having a meeting, I can put a notification out, and they're not going to come. But we actually went to them and went to the neighborhood organizations and the pastors that had the trust in these neighborhoods, and that's who brought folks to us. So you have to go to them and encourage, or go and visit them and ask those questions.
That's I think that's a really good point. It's two, so I'm going to end on one question that really either one of you can answer. And I'm going to try to combine many questions here, but there were a lot of questions related to catchment areas, and if kind of I'll give a layman's term to define catchment areas, because that was one of the questions, is really the area around defining around a transit station, and help me out here, Fred and Rich, if a transit stop, if I'm fill in at any point, but it's really, how far are you trying to catch people at that transit stop, quite literally? And so they'll often talk about, people are willing to bike a mile or walk half a mile, and so you're looking at the area around that. And what's interesting is you start to look at more suburban developments, do catchment areas need to be bigger? How do you look, how do you define a catchment area? How does that need to change when you're thinking about equity and mobility? Do we need to kind of redefine a catchment area in terms of mobility? Are there national conversations about that?
I think one of the things we did have, I posted up there, was one of our recommended APTA standards program under the urban design has a defining transit catchment area. It was actually originally called Transit's Area of Influence, and talked about the different different parameters. You know, you have a core transit area, which may be smaller in scale than a primary catchment area, and then a secondary catchment area around the station or stop. And this has been the process of being refreshed, because we're finding with the advent of, I think this is where Fred was getting at, first and last mile, with advent of better, integrating TNCs, the transit network companies, the Ubers and Lyfts, our catchment area expand. That we didn't fully recognize the influence of bike share programs when we first did this back a while ago, and in 2009. So we are working. Our working group is working to update this for this year, and it's going to, I think, with the help of anyone who Fred's help, and it would be great to have him help us work through what this area of influence really means for different parameters, and what it means, the typical area radii by transit mode would, and it'll give you some really great. It'll give you some great sort of basic recommended practice of what those catchment areas would look like. Hope that helps. And I could send this out and post this on the. I could post the existing one, or give this to you to post after on your website, and along with one of the other areas of transit agency partnerships to improve urban design and enhance service effectiveness. I think would be a way to get started for people to look at this, these partnerships that need to happen. You mentioned getting those in there. So I think these would be, but all these recommended practices are available on this webinar, the website for this webinar. And I think, as just another resource to use, and I think that might be beneficial for folks talking about this.
Yeah, and I think just to add on there, I think obviously there's a lot of flexibility in terms of the catchment area. We would often look at we had a bicycle pedestrian master plan that's occurring, simultaneously with this effort. And we try to tie in with those improvements there. FTA has some great funding flexibility. So along our BRT corridor, for example, we would look, okay, you could build, I know you can do bike stuff up to 2 to 3 miles, I think it is, and they can fund that, as well as a half mile for pedestrians. So we would try to match it with, some of the available funding resources. But we started out really just looking at these corridors going, okay, what is the distance that most of the customers are reasonably walking to the stops and, for getting on the bus. And you have a lot of issues. I mean, there are some parts where that catchment area, because you have people that are knowledgeable, they feel safe, they know what they're doing on a bike, but you have in distressed communities, the attitudes towards bicycling are much different too. And so we have to be somewhat sensitive to there. So I think there's just a lot of issues. There's not really a one-size-fits-all approach, but we try to match it up with other efforts, but just really look at what makes the most sense for that corridor. And also, again, given the limited funds, while we would like to say, hey, what would help us build a continuous bike facility that goes off of the main corridor for another 2 miles, but the responsible, just not being able to use those funds for that, it'd be a longer term project. But we wanted to at least start with what can we do to make it safe in the near future while we're waiting to address some of those bigger issues.
Thanks so much. That was fabulous. I am going to wrap up now, but I have to say this is one of my, I love all these webinars, but I know that this webinar was incredibly useful based on the fact that I don't think I've ever received so many questions and so many really, really great questions. Unfortunately, it is now 6 after the hour, depending on where you are, 6. And we're going to wrap up, but I wanted to give a big thank you to your speaker and to remind people all these slides will be available the webinar we've recorded it today. We'll be sending a follow-up recap blog post where we will get to all of the questions, and there were so many great questions. I wish we had another hour, and so we'll get to all of those in the recap blog post. I do want to plug that this is, again, a monthly webinar series. Our next one, we're doing one July 13th. It's hosted by our partner, Transportation for America's Smart City Collaborative on, I think this is a great segue, on Hear from a City that partnered with Lifton Creek Access to their public transit network. And so we'll be sending out information on how to register for that, but that really gets to how is shared mobility contributing to first and last mile connectivity, and I think it's a great follow-up to this presentation. So again, a big thank you to our speakers. I thought this was just a fabulous webinar, and both of you are really inspiring for me, and thank you all, and have a great rest of your morning if you're me on the West Coast, or good afternoon if you're Fred and Rich on the East Coast. So I will look forward to having you join us again for our next webinar hosted by the Complete Streets Coalition, which is Greening the Streets, Complete Streets, and Stormwater Management that we're co-hosting with NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials, on their new urban stormwater manual. And so we will talk to you all shortly. Thanks so much and have a great day.